Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that today this oration takes place on Aboriginal land. Despite white settlement and mining and this land having been stripped of all its trees, the first metre of earth, the rivers diverted and drained, that the remnants of Aboriginal people still remain here. So we're here and we're proud and we're strong. I'd like to acknowledge the Yitmathang, Doodarowa Waiwaru and Bangarang people who have a strong connection to this part of the country. I'd also like to acknowledge our neighbouring tribes and clans, Wiradjuri, Tangarong, Gunai Kurnai, and Yorta Yorta people. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to my elders past and present, to the people that remain here. Their spirit is strong. People that are buried in the earth, they still stay here today and they're still with us always. I'd like to acknowledge all our other Aboriginal people in the room today, my brothers and sisters from the Tamara region, welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge other Aboriginal people, my Gunditjmara sister and her beautiful son. I'd like to acknowledge Cooper. As young people, young Aboriginal people, they're our strongest cohort and they're the people we rely on. So I'd like to acknowledge him and make him realise that he's a strong, proud Aboriginal man and he's our future. Hello everybody, my name is Luke Brock. I'm a proud Gunditjmara man from the southwest of Victoria. And I welcome you to the 16th George Briscoe Kerford oration. I'm a little bit nervous, but it's all right, so is the Senator, she just told me. Based on the feedback that we've received following the last two orations, we have chosen to consider how we might best engage First Nations people. Inviting them to BMC would be a pretty good start, I reckon. Build on a truly united Australia which brings community together and actively addresses the inequalities which faces many Aboriginal people today. How do we bring this community together and bring them in with our community? I thank you for being here this morning, and I consider everybody here a special guest. I would like to, however, make particular mention of our orator, Senator Malarndirri McCarthy, the past orators, Mrs. Cathy McGowan, Federal Member for Indi, Mr. Bill Wilson. I'd also like to mention our special representatives from WAW Credit Union, Michael Mack, and Indio Shire Council Mayor Jenny O'Connor, and the descendants of the George Briscoe Kerford, who I'll mention a little bit later about. I also have an apology here from La Trobe University sponsor, Natalie McDonald. Now, our distinguished orator. Senator McCarthy is a Yangara Gara woman from the Gulf country of the Northern Territory. She first entered the public sphere as a journalist with the ABC and more recently with SBS NITV. Senator McCarthy was elected to the Northern Territory Assembly as the member for Arnhem Land in 2005. And during her 7 years in the Assembly, she held the ministerial portfolios of local government, regional development, Indigenous development, tourism, women's policy and statehood. She was elected as a Senator for the Northern Territory in August 2016. Please welcome Senator McCarthy to deliver the 16th George Briscoe Kerford oration.
Thank you, Luke. And yes, very nervous. Can you hear the creaking of this stage? Got a bit of a dance happening here, I think. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the town of Beechworth is situated in an area in Victoria, which was owned in accordance with the traditional laws and customs of the Bunurong, Doodarowa, Waimoru, language group. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of neighbouring countries, and especially the Itmathan of the mountain country, the Yora Yora, the Tangarong, and Gunai Kurnai, and Wiradjuri peoples. I acknowledge that these groups still exercise strong traditional culture today and are vibrant living First Nations communities in this region. I understand that traditional ownership of this area is contested, and as a First Nations woman, it is important for me to be really straight in acknowledging this. And I so much want to acknowledge the First Nations men and women in the room, the elders past and present who give great wisdom to those of us present here today and to our future generations to come. I acknowledge too the Ware mob. Beautiful to see your mob here, make me feel really strong. You eh? Wajina yamli enda ngana yanyo alianta wiriara. Ngaraji from the Gulf country of Barlula, Guranji Mara Garawa Yanua. That is all my families, and I call on the spirits of the Lianta Wiriara. We are, as the Yanua people, known for our spiritual origin that comes from the sea country, the Nyimaringa and Jungai, and how wherever we travel of the Gudjiga, we take the knowledge and the love and care and concern for our story and our country in our relationships with those we meet along the way. I thank each and every one of you for being present. I'm bowled over that when I was told there were 500 shares being put out, and I went, I thought I was speaking to about 30, 40 people. Well, you might have got nothing better to do in this area, eh? But it's just wonderful, and this is the place where I'd like to acknowledge the organisers of the Kerford Oration and to thank you for the opportunity to speak here in your beautiful town of Beechworth, so rich in the history of this extraordinary nation, and what a history. The Kerford Oration honours a former pillar of the Beechworth community who truly shaped the future of the state of Victoria. George Kerford, as you would all know, was a community leader, Premier of Victoria, and Judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria, among many other accolades. I'm just going to have to move this microphone a little bit. I think it's blocking my... Am I interrupting any of the sound there? Is that okay? Okay. But there was also the heyday of the gold rush in Beechworth in the 1850s, the stationing of Robert O'Hara Burke, leader of the ill-fated Burke and Wills expedition, I have found out, as Inspector of Police at Beechworth in 1854 to 57, and Australia's first native-born Governor-General and High Court Judge, Sir Isaac Isaacs, who spent his formative years and schooling at Beechworth. And of course, Ned Kelly and his gang had numerous links to Beechworth. He himself was imprisoned here for a period, with 21 of his supporters also being held without trial or evidence in the Beechworth jail, which I had a quick look at from a distance last night. Thanks to Bill Wilson. Forgive me for my very brief summary of the key people and events in this town, but it's been important for me to learn about you. As much as you're here to hear my stories, it's important. Two-way learning. Yanyo Garawa, we want you to learn about us, but we need to also learn about you. My point is that Beechworth has clearly been witness to people and events that are matters of great national pride, things that unite us as a nation. And at this point, I would also like to acknowledge your member of the Federal Parliament, Cathy McGowan. Yes. Like many places in Australia, historical records favour the settlers in Beechworth. There are numerous wonderful books and local histories written about Beechworth and the area, but they are tales of certain people and events interpreted in a very certain way. While we can read of their achievements and foibles, other voices are silenced. This is the bias of the colonial archive. This is why truth-telling about First Nations lives and experiences remain elusive. And I quote from a March 2018 Guardian article by a Wiradjuri scholar and activist, Nathan Sentence, to give an eloquent sense of what I mean. And I quote his words: "Galleries, libraries, archives and museums are considered sites of memory, spaces to engage with history and identity, but for me these places are the sites of forgetting, erasure and distortion. They are built on stolen land, their names validate the place names that colonisers used to confirm their occupation of stolen land and to nullify the history that took place before colonial invasion. My ancestors are in these memory institutions, but their voices are missing from the words written, the art created, and the cultural objects taken. All of their cultural knowledge and their history is recorded and interpreted through the coloniser's lens. We are part of the memory conveyed by galleries, libraries, archives and museums, but we have had no say or agency in the construction of it." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to try to give a voice in my way to the experiences of First Nations people and perhaps share a little bit about Beechworth area in that respect, particularly during the early years of the colony and the gold rush. And to do this, I'm indebted in particular to the painstaking historical research of local historian Dr. Jackie Durrant. I thoroughly recommend her blog, Life on Spring Creek, to all of you here. Following a reflection on what First Nations people in the Beechworth area and further afield experienced and survived, I then want to draw parallels between these experiences here in your region and those of my own family and ancestors in the Borroloola region in the Northern Territory. Where I come from is 1,000 kilometres almost southeast of Darwin in the Northern Territory, and I'd like to take you today to that place and bring you back again today. Is that okay? Yeah. Beechworth and Borroloola may not seem similar places on the surface, but there is a shared history. And finally, I want to reflect on what and who has survived and what we must do as a nation, bravely and boldly, to forge a new understanding built on truth-telling. So with Beechworth, of course, as you will know, the First Nations people lived here uninterrupted for thousands of years before Major Mitchell passed through northeast Victoria in 1836, declaring the lush forested country with abundant water resources to be Australia Felix. Squatters, new land and opportunity followed. Only 2 years later, in April 1838, squatters George and William Faithful, together with 18 men, were attacked at Benalla, about 80 kilometres from Beechworth, as you would all know, by a group of 20 Aboriginal people. A plaque near Benalla records the day in 1838 when settlers' drays were attacked in a fight that cost 8 white lives and 1 Aboriginal life. It does not mention the years of reprisals that are said to have later resulted in the deaths of up to 100 Aboriginal people in the area. nor does it mention the research of historian Judith Bassett, which suggests that the motivation for the attack may have been retribution by a ritually sanctioned punitive party for the shooting of several Aboriginal people by the squatters days earlier. Historians such as Bassett, let alone First Nations people trying to understand our own families' histories, have huge challenges reconstructing events due to the fact that the contemporaneous sources for study are the written records of the Europeans, prejudiced, deficient as they may be. However, some things are clear from the fragmentary records left by the settlers, and this is in a letter from George Faithful to Governor Charles Joseph Latrobe in July 1858, and is quoted also from Jackie Durrant's website. And I quote, "At last it so happened that I was the means of putting an end to this warfare. Riding with two of my stockmen one day quietly along the banks of the Ovens River, we were all at once met by some hundreds of painted warriors with the most dreadful yells I had ever heard. Had they sprung from the regions below, we could have hardly been more taken by surprise. Our horses bounded and neighed, and fear, old brutes, our first impulse was to retreat. But we found the narrow way blacked up by natives 2 and 3 deep, and we were at once saluted with a shower of spears. My horse bounded and fell into an immense hole. A spear just then passed over the pommel of my saddle. This was the signal for a general onset, that's meant to be, just seeing if you're awake. The natives rushed on us like furies with shouts and savage yells. It was no time for delay. I ordered my men to take deliberate aim and to fire only with certainty of destruction to the individual aimed at. Unfortunately, the first shot from one of my men's carbines did not take effect. In a moment, we were surrounded on all sides by the savages boldly coming up to us. It was my time now to endeavour to repel them. I fired my double barrel right and left, and 2 of the most forward fell. This stopped the impetuosity of their career. I had time to reload, and the war thus began, continued from about 10 o'clock in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Think about that. We were slow to fire, which prolonged the battle, and 60 rounds were fired, and I trust and believe that many of the bravest of the savage warriors hit the dust. It was remarkable that the children and many of the women likewise had so little fear that they boldly ran forward, even under our horses' legs, picked up the spears and carried them back to the warrior men. We at least beat them off the field and found that they had a fine fat bullock, some of it roasting, some cut up ready for the spit, and more cattle dread ready to portion out. The fight I have described gave them a nation of what sort of stuff the white man was made of, and my name was a terror to them ever after." That was a letter from George Faithful to Governor Charles Joseph Latrobe in July 1858. As Durrant notes correctly, and as it is abundantly clear to me, the fact that the Aboriginal people were painted up suggests that Faithful had interrupted a ceremony of some kind. Women and children are present. There is a bullock being roasted as a celebration. The shower of spears seems more a warning than an attack. But 60 rounds of ammunition are fired with certainty of destruction to the individual aimed at, so that the bravest of the savage warriors bit the dust. As historian Michael Cannon relates in his book, Australia in the Victorian Age, Life in the Country, The battle lasted 6 hours, and to, quote, "To judge from Faithful's narrative, the white men must have killed about 50 Aborigines," end of quote. In this one retaliation alone. So one wonders about retaliations, about which there remain no written records. I'm going to take you to Borroloola now, to my home country. I want to move away from the killing times of this country that I've just spoken about to the savanna floodplains, coastal mangroves and bountiful seas of the Gulf of Carpentaria, through which the majestic McCarthy River snakes its life-giving force. These are the traditional lands of the Yanyuwa, the Garoa, the Mara and the Gurindji peoples. I was born in Katherine in 1970 and grew up in the main township in this beautiful Gulf country of the Northern Territory. Borroloola is, as I said, located nearly 1,000 kilometres southeast of Darwin and by air it's probably about 700 kilometres. My mother was a Yanyuwa Garoa woman who has since passed on, and she was believed to have been born in the 1950s. There are no records of her birth. And interestingly enough, just a side distraction there, can you imagine the citizenship question for me in trying to show that I was Aboriginal? But that's another story, let me tell you. My father was descended from Irish immigrants who sailed from Ireland to Sydney to make a new life in this country, in this island home that we all call home. The lands and seas around Borroloola are given force, meaning and life by what we call the Gujiga, the song cycles that traverse this region. In our language we call it Gujiga, songline or map. You know, the Murunpatha would have a different name. For the Anangu in Central Australia they call it Yugurba. So we have the song lines which are essentially us. They tell our story, but they help us to keep telling our story. The Gujiga tells of our laws. Indeed, they are our laws and they are our title deeds. As the wonderful Gulgudini McDini, my grandfather, told a dear friend of mine who works as a professor here in Victoria, Guru John Bradley. And I quote, "Whitefella got that piece of paper, might be lease or something like that, but Yanyuwa and Garoa mob, they got to have Gujiga. When Whitefella asks them kids how you know this country belongs to you, they can say we got the Gujiga. Gujiga, you know, like that piece of paper." End of quote. Another way to think of Gujiga when I'm trying to teach our non-Indigenous youth, and I do take students up to Borroloola from Sydney and teach them many things. Gujiga, while we call it and refer to it as a map or songline, another way of thinking about it is like your GPS. You know, you have a GPS now and you say, I want to go somewhere. Well, that just takes you somewhere. Well, the Gujiga is our song. So what we would do and still do is sing the song as you travel across country, so you are mapping out where you're going. And so our grandparents and great-grandparents would sing those songs and pass the songs down. So when we're walking across that country, we know where to walk, what to be careful of, what to look out for, where the crocodiles are harvesting, laying their eggs, where we've got to make sure we don't swim, where we've got to go in terms of not coming across areas sacred that we shouldn't be in. That's the Gujiga, our songline, our map. My history and my culture are buried deep in the land and waters through which the Gujiga flow, and I want to give you a sense of what it was like growing up there on the other end of the country. We still go hunting and fishing. It's just what we do as family. It's where we sit around the fire and we tell stories, and we laugh a lot. We need to laugh a lot because there's a great deal of sadness that impacts First Nations people in this country. Too many are jailed for too long. Too many are dying. to many around renal dialysis and health conditions that no Australian should be experiencing. But our young people are experiencing it as young as 17, 18. And if their lives are about walking into a renal dialysis centre and thinking, is that my future? Well, of course it's not your future. And every Australian should be furious about that vision of our future. So we go out on country to feel strong in spirit, in mind, and to remember and reflect that we are strong people. Across the Sir Edward Pellew Islands, we'd look for bush foods and medicines, bigigi, green plums, bilberry, sugar bag, auga, blue-tongue lizard, arumu, sharks, akunubala, bush turkey, and ngulumiri, barramundi, lots of that. Learning all the time from our families, grandmothers, aunties, sisters as we travelled. And I'd watch the old people make canoes and dugong harpoons by hand from Mabiu, lie, cart pine in Borroloola before heading out to the islands for fishing. So our sea country, Liantha Wiriara, our sea country is full of not just the crocodiles, but also of the dugongs and sea turtles, which are very much strong ancestral beings in our Gujiga and our songs and stories. So we would have ceremonies and continue to have ceremonies about the dance of our ancestors and learning and listening to the old people. We learn that from our old people the complexities in relationships governing how Yanyuwa people use, own and manage land and sea country. We have what's called two names. I'm teaching you a lot of Yanyuwa today. I'm going to check this on your mob when I'm finished. Two names. One is called Nyemringi and the other one is called Jungai. Nyemringi and Jungai is very important. We can't make decisions without the Nyemringi or the Jungai. So when developers want to go into the Borroloola region, they think they can only go talk to one Aboriginal person and then that decision is made. It's not made. You cannot speak to just one person. Part of our system, and still continues on, is it's a respectful system of the kinship system where Nyemringi and Jungai, Nyemringi means the traditional owner of the area and Jungai means the police or protector. A simple way for me to explain it to you is like my children are Jungais. I'm Nyemringi. I'm Nyemringi for my country. I'm the traditional owner for that country, but my children are not the traditional owners. They are the police protectors of that country. So while I'm teaching my children to take their place in society, in Western society, they must also learn their roles and responsibilities of looking after country in the kinship system. So they learn two ways. So if my sons were to say something to me, I have to think sometimes, oh, are they having a go at me? Or are they giving me information that's related to their custodial duties? And it's just the way we are. It's the way we keep our culture strong. I also learned that the sea, more than any other geographical feature for the Yanyuwa, reflects our existence and our identity. And we use the term Liantha Wiriara, the people of the sea, the people whose spiritual origin comes from the sea country, to describe ourselves because we are saltwater people. To the Yanyuwa, the sea is an ancestral being, and there are many Yanyuwa words to describe all its movements and its qualities. We have a dictionary. Yeah, you can find it if you want. You can learn Yanyuwa. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Just like I know you can learn the language of this place too, which I think is a wonderful thing. One of my teachers, Yanyuwa elder and law woman Dana Norman Mungarai, said these beautiful words about the importance of the sea to Yanyuwa people, and I quote, "Let me tell you something about the sea, the salt water, the waves, They are my mother. The sea is my mother. It is her ancestral being. I know this. I have known this since I was small. Further, I will tell you the sea has names, many names. Names for the reefs, names for the seagrass beds, names for the sandbars. And the sea has boundaries, and we know these boundaries. They did not come here recently. From the time of the spirit ancestors and our human ancestors, they have been here. Our songs and ceremony, our gujiga, are also in the sea. They are running through the sea, along the bottom of the sea, and they also rise and travel on the surface of the sea. White people think the sea is empty, that it has no law, but the law and the ceremony is there in the salt water. In the seabirds, the dugong and the turtle, it is there. And we knowledgeable people are holding it. End of quote. That's my great-grandmother. She still growls me today if I do something wrong. And even if I don't, she's still there with us, you know, really strong. In Yanyuwa culture, the sea demands a different way of doing things. Ancestral beings first travel the seas, some in the image of species such as sharks, marine turtles, dugong, and seabirds, for example, and others are human-like in forms such as Limamaranja, dugong hunters who travelled throughout the Sir Edward Pellew Islands. As these beings travel, they transform their bodies or move their bodies in certain ways, creating reefs, sandbars, the tides and tidal currents. These are among the many beings that made journeys and from whom Yanyuwa people are descendant today. I learned also of the complex systems that govern the use of resources on Yanyuwa country. When Captain Cook arrived in 1770, there was already a thriving cultural and economic exchange happening within Australia and with people from outside Australia, like the Macassans from Sulawesi. First Nations people were trading partners who shared knowledge and exchanged marine sources and tools in the form of harpoons for hunting and knowledge of carving canoes to set sail in the unpredictable wet season seas of the top end. There were intermarriages and relationships. These are just some of the Yanyuwa laws. We are still learning more all the time. But like First Nations people of the Beechworth area, the land and my culture, my laws, my gujiga have also been questioned, threatened. It took us nearly 4 decades to prove in a Western court that we are Malarndirri, that we have always been there of the Yanyuwa and Garwa country. We were the first under the 1976 Aboriginal Land Rights Act to go for land, and they held the hearing in an old police station. Have a think about that one. Where people had to speak English but couldn't. So in that first hearing, we didn't get much recognition at all. In fact, very little. And the Yanyuwa were demoralised, devastated, and made to feel really ashamed for trying. But we didn't give up. That was my grandparents. And then in 1992, we tried again. And again. And then finally, 4 decades later, from 1976, all of the Yanyuwa country was officially recognised. And even more than that, the Western courts of this country also acknowledged that we had had trading rights with the Macassans and Sulawesi people of Sulawesi well before white settlement in the area and colonisation of the region. European law, or a lack of it, did have a brutal face during frontier times in the Gulf of Carpentaria, including in the traditional countries of the Yanyuwa, the Mara, Gurindji and Garwa peoples around Borroloola. Historian Tony Roberts recently estimated in an article in The Monthly that at least 600 men, women, children and babies, or about 1/6 of the population, were killed in the Territory's Gulf country to 1920. The numbers may be higher, up to 700 or 800, yet no one was charged with these murders. By contrast, there were 20 white deaths. It's hard to overemphasise how much the killing times impacted our people. The letter from George Faithful that I quoted earlier reminds me of other settler accounts of violence in my own Gulf country. And this is from Tony Roberts' recent monthly article, and I just quote, "The bland phrase frontier violence conveys little of the horrors inflicted. Even before the Gulf leases were granted, there were pitched battles. Massacres started on the coast track in 1872 when overlanders began passing through with cattle and horses. A member of the first party described in a long article for the Brisbane Courier the deadly effect, even at 350 and 400 yards, of their state-of-the-art rifles, adding, "Still the blacks showed a bold front and were not driven back without an obstinate resistance." Further on, at the Cox River near Limonbite, they encountered a large number of people painted for ceremonies. Again, they fired from a distance, yet for nearly a full half hour, the original inhabitants held their ground in the face of strong weapons, of whose deadliness they received momentarily fearful proofs in the numbers of their comrades who writhed or lay forever motionless." End of quote. The parallels with the Faithful letter are clear, right down to the ceremonial painting and the celebration of the deadly power of the settlers' weaponry. But somehow, Yanyuwa, Mara, Gurangi and Garawa societies outlived this violence. We had been totally disposed of in our traditional lands and food sources, killed, made ill with new diseases and even starved. But the people continued to sing the Gujiga. Yanyuwa law continued to be observed. We are survivors. First Nations people across this country survive. One story of such survival was told by my grandmother, Nancy McDinney, in her painting Story of Mayawagu. She said about that powerful painting where she travels the country and is an amazing artist, and I quote, "This painting is about Mayawagu, who was my great-grandfather. He was a Garawa man who resisted the white pastoralists in the early 1900s. The painting shows the time Mayawagu escaped from the policemen and trackers who came to capture him. Mayawagu was strong, he was fighting for his land and fighting for his people. In Mayawagu's country, called Kalagilinda, there is a river called the Fulsh River. Inspector Paul Fulsh was in charge of policing in the northern half of the Northern Territory from 1870 to 1904. He was responsible for masterminding the massacres of hundreds of Aboriginal men, women and children, including Garawa people. We would like to change the name of the river, Fulsh River, and call it the Mayawagu River." End of quote. So I share with First Nations people of the Beechworth area a history of violence and that dispossession. The killing times are our shared history, as much as the Gujiga or songlines that crisscross the entire country. But I also share a story of cultural survival with the First Nations people of this region. In the midst of the gold rush years here in Beechworth, Durrant documents evidence of a remarkably vibrant First Nations culture from two newspaper reports in the late 1850s, and I quote one of them now. Towards the end of 1856, a remnant of the Bawiji blacks were in existence, King Billy, their leader, being a familiar character. He was adorned with a brass plate suspended from his neck with his name engraved on it, which he was very proud. They held a corroboree on the site when Mr. S.H. Rundle's residence was situated. The moon was at its full. They were painted with white lines that gave them the resemblance to skeletons, and danced around a fire while two old gins kept up a tattoo with sticks and made a droning kind of noise. There was no melody in it, but the time was perfect. End of quote. Despite the clear prejudice, it is an evocative account that tells me about the strength of culture here in the face of recent violence and continuing incursions on country by those seeking wealth through gold. I wonder how King Billy and his female companions would have related these events. Have a think about that one. I wonder what stories they would tell you about the ritual significance of the body paint, why the ceremony was being held at a full moon, and what its deeper purpose was, the ageless meaning of the songs being sung, which maybe I would recognise as Gudjuga, although they would have a different name for it. Song cycles tracing the travels of their own ancestors and creator spirits as they move through the country. All this is missed in that newspaper account. Even after the gold rush, when the Aboriginal Protection Act 1869 Victoria was enacted, First Nations people of this region survived, and they survive strongly today, just as my people do in the Gulf region. While some of our ancestors may have been killed or moved off country onto reserves by the Aboriginal protection, our descendants, all the descendants are still here, asserting claims. Their song lines, I can hear them and I can feel them, feel the spirit of this place. You may think it's strange that I'm talking about times of division, struggle and violence in a speech about a unified vision for Australia. But to be a unified Australia, we first have to engage in truth-telling about our history, and to be brave and bold as a nation in doing so. This means embracing not only the Kerfords, the Ned Kellys, Burkes and Isaacs, but also the King Billys, the Mayawagus. And it also means recognising and interrogating the inherent bias in the colonial record. It is an enormous task, but I am hopeful. I do believe it can be done. This is a vital step along the path to true reconciliation. You can't have it without truth-telling. And I believe all of Australia is ready for this. I'm immensely proud of the role that I have alongside Senator Patrick Dodson and Linda Burney as fellow First Nations people in the Parliament. And I acknowledge too the work of Ken White, a First Nations man from WA, of the previous Senator Jackie Lambie, who stood to tell her story and was held down over it. It is a struggle, but when people stand as First Nations people to declare their sense of self and identity, we all need to take a deep breath and pay much greater respect. You don't know the stories that people have travelled and struggled through to be the people that they are today. And that can be said of any Australian. Here in Victoria, First Nations people share something with Northern Territory First Nations people. I watched with elation as the first ever Australian legislation was passed to create a framework for the negotiation of a treaty or treaties with First Nations people in Victoria. As complex, difficult as that may be, your jurisdiction has taken that brave step. Embrace it, learn from it, make it work, Insist that as fellow Victorians, you should know your history in this state. And if you are genuinely going to go forward in treaties or a treaty with First Nations people, do it with all sincerity from in here. Just a few days before your legislation was enacted in relation to a treaty or treaties, I attended the historic moment at the Barunga Festival when the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory signed a Memorandum of Understanding with all 4 Northern Territory land councils to pursue a treaty in the Northern Territory or treaties. It represented the first significant step in advancing treaties in the Territory since the call for a national treaty in the historic Barunga Statement by the Northern and Central Land Councils nearly 30 years ago. If you don't know that history, I'll share a little bit of it with you. The Barunga Statement, and if ever you go to Canberra, the Barunga Statement sits in the halls of Canberra. You can go and read it and have a good look and remember this story. Gudjiga, this is Gudjiga too that I'm teaching you. Go and have a look at that Barunga Statement. It was presented by Galarrwuy Yunupingu and Wenton Rabunja, the late Wenton Rabunja, to Prime Minister Bob Hawke at the Barunga Festival in June 1988. It included a log of claims that included self-determination and self-management, control and enjoyment of our ancestral lands, compensation and full civil, economic, social and cultural rights, and a call for a treaty. Prime Minister Hawke promised but did not deliver on a treaty for First Nations people in Australia. I am hopeful, I do believe, that we are even closer now than ever before in doing this. In the Labor Party, and I bring the Labor Party in now because I've just talked about Bob Hawke, and I tell you what, as a member of the Labor Party and standing there at Barunga Statement on the grounds there and going, this is really shame job, you mob. How come this was never advanced? You know, this was something that, if a promise is made, especially on something as serious and symbolic as this was back in '88, why has there been no advancements? So there is a Labor for Treaty movement in the Northern Territory, and I'm certainly excited about what prospects treaty negotiations may hold, especially when I think about, on a personal level, for the Yanyuwa, Garowa, Mara and Gurindji peoples of the region where I come from. And I have to look at it in that context because it helps me to then explain when I'm sitting in the caucus room or when I'm sitting in the Parliament, in the Senate, so I can bring forward, two-way learning. It's really hard. It is enormously complex at times, deeply emotional, trying to share and trying to educate the Parliament of the importance of First Nations cultures and specifically of the area where I come from. The process of treaty making and of truth-telling is going to be hard, and there will be disputes, including about who owns country and how governance arrangements should be made. It will involve an honest reckoning with the events of our past, how they have been told and in whose favour. It will involve bringing to light voices that have been hidden or erased. It will involve an appraisal of what is being delivered in the way of services and vital infrastructure today to Indigenous communities, and it will involve listening and letting the First Nations people lead the way through this process. And I know Cathy and I are working on a committee, a joint committee of the Parliament, in relation to the steps of what would a voice to the federal Parliament look like, where First Nations people can contribute directly to the Parliament. It's a parliamentary committee that we are taking across the country and will continue to do so up until November. There will be an interim report released, hopefully early next week. So hot off the press, you can go online and have a look at that, and I urge you to read that report. It will be our interim report on where we're moving as a country in Australia and the possibilities that we could go in terms of First Nations people and also the Parliament. Of course, complexities do not mean that we should not do it. in terms of finding a way forward. They do not mean we should not face the truth of what happened in northeastern Victoria as well as in the Northern Territory during those early years of settlement. We should bring these events to the fore to forge a brave and bold and unified Australia. I want to leave you, ladies and gentlemen, with the words from my Yanyuwa elder, Ngaji Dinah Norman, and also my other Ngaji who's passed away, Annie Karakan. Najang ngana yarwar ngana walaguru, bara urumolo bane waramantu, bane ngalbidi ngagri waborangu, liwangala, lingamala goju, lingamala muri, lingamala ngabiji, lingamala gardedi, galo kantanane nganya, ngamawai, jawini awola, anta yungurmata, para, niri lingarari, niri lingamai. Yurung manta paneru, uraitku. These words in Yanyuwa mean, this law is important. It is powerful. Don't break it. Don't be ignorant of it. It is from the past, from the old people. Our mothers' brothers, our fathers' fathers, our fathers' mothers, and our mothers' brothers, they carried this law. This law is in the country and the sea for all time. Listen to it, remember it. It is for all time. Do not leave it behind as some kind of rubbish. Oh, Bawjibara, thank you.
Wow. I just said how proud of you, but it's more about how proud am I, as a First Nations Aboriginal man from this part of Victoria, or from Victoria. You know, I'm only one generation from not being on Aboriginal mission. Me and my sister are only one generation from not having to carry an Aboriginal card or be a ward of the state just because we're Aboriginal. We're a product of white settlement, but we're not a product. We're a product of a loving family and a very special, we're very lucky to be a part of the oldest living culture in the world. Your words are absolutely beautiful. To hear language, but to hear the strong connection of the Northern Territory and Victoria, and just to have that strong Aboriginal voice, someone that can speak up for all of us, is, you should be proud. I'm proud, and we're all proud, and we're all lucky. Thank you. So rightio, it's your turn. What we've got now, we've got two microphones around. We've got one here, one here. So we're going to take question time now. So please make sure that give your name first and make sure that it's actually a question. It's not a statement about how good you are. All right. And just also remember, please remember, we're also recording this. Okay. Just put your hand up, yep.
Yep. Okay. My name's Kelly. I was just wanting to find out quickly what led you into Parliament and into the Senate? What motivated you?
Hi, Kelly. I first entered the Northern Territory Parliament in 2005, and I guess as a Yanyuwa Garwa woman, we had fought so long for many decades, and politics, being First Nations in this country, we are political because we need to survive. We're political, we may not be in political parties, whatever, but our politics is a politics of survival. So I felt in 2005 when the former member for Arnhem, John Arquette, retired, I thought I'd really like to have a go and see if I could work for the people of Arnhem Land, which is different to where I come from. Because I thought I could learn more about other First Nations people, but also because I felt that I'd had enormous support over my life to learn the things I wanted to give back, and to see what I could do with people across the Northern Territory. I was a Member of Parliament as a result of that, and it was a passion that took me right across the Territory. Then I lost my seat in 2012. And so when I lost my seat, that was when there was a complete change of government, so a lot of us lost our seats. I was happy that I'd done the best that I could, and, time to move on. And as it turned out, 4 years later, I was working back with SBS as a journalist, and I just left SBS and set up my own business. And you may recall the federal election of 2016 was an 8-week election campaign. Well, the previous senator for the Northern Territory, Nova Peris, stood down in the middle of that campaign. So it had been going for 4 weeks, and for personal reasons she decided to step down. And so they were in a bit of a hurry to find someone, actually, Kelly, to be honest. So there were, I guess, a fair few of us who had 24 hours to make up our minds. Were we going to throw our hat in? I did. I threw my hat in, and I'm here before you. Yeah.
It's Kate Sutherland from Beechworth. I'm just wondering, thank you very much for your oration this morning. I'm wondering if you could give us some practical steps as community members and non-Aboriginal people as to how we might be able to enable the lives of Aboriginal people in very practical ways at community level.
Thank you, Kate. Look, I think it is always quite simple. It is actually about getting to know the families in your own area, who the people are, the organisations. I think building on that, one of the key things is always about relationships. Like anything, build the relationships with First Nations people. And if you haven't had that opportunity, don't be afraid to ask. I think that's another thing we sort of learned this morning, really, just talking with Luke and others this morning, that some people are reluctant to, in terms of non-Indigenous people, to want to step in that space. And I think that's respectful, but you don't know unless you have a go. And I think that there must be opportunities in this area for those relationships to grow. And you've got to open your hearts to that. But also acknowledge that there is deep hurt as well. So it may take a lot of time.
Senator Father Thomas from the Anglican Church in Beechworth. Truth-telling first, Senator. I know that I stand here as a representative of an institution which was not only complicit with the repression of culture, but actively involved not only in the removal of culture and of faith, but also the removal of children from families. And so, as a part of that institution, I continue our apology to you as First Peoples. Senator, one of the things that the churches have been trying to do, particularly in the state of Victoria, is work very hard at building our relationship with the First Peoples. And so we have things such as acknowledgement of country in our own church. That's a part of our pew bulletin every Sunday. It's in our porch. And at major events within our regional area, we often have welcome to country. Much of that feels very tokenistic to me. And I'm wondering if that's actually a white fella's perspective on that. How do we build on this in a way that it ceases to be just mere tokenism?
Sure. Father Thomas, thank you, and thank you for your truth-telling. Still a way to go in all of those areas, I know. This is a question I actually get asked, even from my own dad. My dad's not Indigenous. I think it's an important one. And it's made me think a bit about that. And I thought, well, when I go to schools and when I talk to a next generation of young Australians, they're more savvy as a result of it. They are way more savvy about First Nations culture in a way that my dad's generation would never, ever be able to be. And I think that in itself is enough for now. Because when I go to and I do a lot of schools, go to a lot of schools, universities and youth, and when they stand up and do it in their way, and I talk to the kids later on, because this is what interests me. This is actually about the teaching for our generations of Australians coming through. And already they're wanting to do other things with First Nations people. They want to learn the languages. They want to go to the communities. We receive and welcome so many school groups from Southern Australia across the Northern Territory just to spend time with First Nations children. That's our future. That's what those acknowledgements are doing. They mightn't seem different to you, but have a look at the young ones. You'll see a different story.
Hello, my name is Marion and I'm from Beechworth. I have a granddaughter that I'm bringing up, and to the lady who spoke from Beechworth, we go out, we still get a lot of people saying, why do you bother? If she wears her Aboriginal clothes, they say, why has she got that on? It's not celebration time or anything. So there is still problems.
Thank you. Was it Marilyn? Marion, beg your pardon, thank you. Well, that's just downright racist, you mob, let me tell you now. Don't do that. You know, people have, as I said to you, First Nations people in this country have their own stories. You know, be open of heart, keep a teachable heart. Don't think you know everything, because you don't. I keep having to talk through that myself on different things, whether it's in legislation, in the Senate, in the Parliament, whether I'm talking about issues that impact committees that we work on. You know, I listen to the families of Newcastle. We're going to Oakey, who are going to talk about the enormous suffering they're experiencing because of contaminated water from Defence Forces. I listen and I learn, and their stories, they matter, but so does ours. Listen. When First Nations people are telling you a story about themselves or wearing something to make them feel strong for them. Don't rubbish them. Thank you.
Thank you. We've just got one more. I think we've just got time for a couple more, if there's a couple more questions.
It's Michael Curtin here from Beechworth. The Uluru Statement for the Heart seemed to be the closest we've got to, I guess, hearing Aboriginal voice and making a difference to government and the way Aboriginal voice is heard in Parliament and that. And yet it was dismissed. And I'm wondering how we recapture what was, to me, it seemed to be, from my perspective, a fantastic opportunity to achieve the sorts of things that we're talking about now. So I'm wondering how we recapture or how we work with government to see the importance of this, because it seems to be very political.
Sure. Do many people know about the Uluru Statement from the Heart? Yeah, so there's a general understanding of it. Yep. Okay, look, I think this is one way to look at it. There's lots of ways to look at it. But from a First Nations perspective, that kind of rejection is not unusual. It happens to us all the time. So where the whole country might have been hoping and believing that this particular statement was going to go somewhere, the fact that it didn't, can you recall the feeling that you had? What was that feeling like? I can't... Disappointment? Anger? Disbelief? All right. Well, times that by 10,000 times. When First Nations people try to, over the centuries, have tried to just live a good life and to hold on to the strength of who we are, made to believe, move over this way, live in this mission, go over there, we'll take your kids from you. Oh, listen, you know, you need to have a pass to go from this place to that place, but we might pass pieces of legislation to let you do it. Oh, sorry, we can't do that. You're going to have to do this. That feeling of disappointment, hold on to that, because that is the closest feeling you're going to have to how First Nations people feel when we're always trying to rise above oppression. I'll give you a perspective from the Parliament of what we are trying to do differently. And I'm enormously grateful, you know, to work beside Cathy, to work beside members of Parliament on all sides who are genuinely trying to pursue the voice and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Members of Parliament who are working together to say, you know what, Prime Minister, what you did there was just so not on. It was really not a good thing to do. This parliamentary committee and the report I just mentioned earlier that's going to be released early next week, it's a midterm report. This parliamentary committee is trying to move our country beyond that feeling of enormous disappointment, disbelief and anger. But we're going to need you, each and every Australian, to get behind us. Black, white, young, old, Northern Australia, Southern Australia. We're going to need every Australian. It has to be, because the Uluru Statement from the Heart, there is one word there that is, I think, enormously symbolic, and we have to use symbolism in this moment, and that is the heart. The heart. What is in your heart? And what is it within each of our hearts that can unite us to bring about a better Australia? Yeah, Bauji Baro.
We just have time for one final question, thank you.
There you go. I guess my question is, it may already be happening, is what role the sporting clubs would be playing in Beechworth with the community. Growing up in Melbourne, my whole football life I played against two Aboriginal players. One was Kevin Williams, under 10s, still remember the game. We won the flag, he nearly beat us. It was unbelievable. He'd go on, he played at Collingwood seconds, and I have bumped into Kev a couple of times, and Roddy Waddell went to Geelong. They were unbelievable players. And, you know, when I see people, you know, like Cyril, that, you know, he's my favourite player, you know, the draw back home to walk away really at the, you know, almost quite peak of his career. You know, sport's just, for me, been amazing breakdown of all that stuff. And,
Yeah.
you know, growing up in Reza, you know, we play with lots of different cultures, and it was amazing, and, you know, that's been my grounding and acceptance, and, you know, I think sport's a great mechanism to break all that stuff down. So,
Yep.
that was
totally.
just my question.
No, look, I totally agree with you. I think sports can be a real leveller in so many ways, and I guess the fact that you're working as a team, you know, I always come back to that, you know, you're working as a team, you're looking out for each other, you're trying to get to know one another, and that in itself is the process of what we're trying to do here, you know, how to support one another, how to work as a team to have a better Australia that recognises, respects, supports, encourages First Nations people to be the people that we're here to be. You know, that to be able to rise above the oppression on so many different levels. And sometimes a lot of that can be just about, you know, the spiritual health and mental health of being able to rise above situations that place us in much great despair. I think with your sports, I'm not sure, I imagine you'd have a lot of teams in the region. I know that Victoria is a very, very strong in the footy, certainly for us mob in the Territory. We watch AFL, and we've got a lot of our legends who've come down here and made their names. But it is. We can always keep going though, be vigilant. I think the thing is to never just do something once. It actually has to be a part of a way of life. So I'm happy to chat with you a bit more afterwards and see what we can do in that space, or what support. I'd like to understand a little bit more about what you're doing. Is that okay? Yeah.
Thanks, Malarndirri. Thank you. We need to move forward now to the George Kerford medal presentation. So I'd like to thank those members of the Kerford family who have travelled to Beechworth to join us this morning. And on this occasion, I invite a good friend of mine, Justin Crawley, from the Dunamar Youth Foundation from Wadair. His foundation aims to improve the lives of young Aboriginal people from the Dunamar region in the Northern Territory through identifying and developing as future leaders. Together with his beautiful wife Beck, they own a social enterprise, the Doomu Cafe, which I believe is making thousands. Yes, Matt, I see you nodding, social enterprise works. And it's the vehicle for where the trainees come down from Wadair, and it gives them an opportunity to learn skills in hospitality and the retail industry. Please welcome Justin Crawley.
I told you one joke, Luke, that was three. It's very humbling to be up here to say thank you to Malarndirri for such a heartfelt insight into the challenges that we all face. And I guess the thing that stands out to me is the invitation to be part of the journey. And the challenge for each and every one of us is what we take out of that and what we do moving forward. Because as Malarndirri clearly and so eloquently pointed out, we all have to be part of that journey if we're going to move forward as a nation. So I think that's, for me, from today, we learnt a heck of a lot about her journey and the relevance from this area up to the Borroloola region. But the thing for me is, what do we do? What does each and every one of us do? Whether it's talking to our children, our grandchildren, whether we're part of an education program at a school or part of a sporting club, how do we make a difference? The honour board over here clearly shows the eminent speakers since 2003. Today is added the name of Senator Malarndirri McCarthy. The George Briscoe Kerford Medal was crafted by George Frimmel of Melbourne and has an image adapted from an 1870 print from the Burke Museum collection. I would now like to invite Nicole Kirkwood, a descendant of George Briscoe Kerford, to join me on stage to present the George Briscoe Kerford Medal to Senator McCarthy. Nicole.
As a descendant of George Kerford, I was chosen today not only because I'm a descendant, but I'm also the mother of my own little descendant who is an Indigenous boy. His father is First Nations Canadian, and his grandmother was the first Aboriginal woman ever elected to Parliament.
Oh, wow.
So even though we may look different, I feel that we have a connection, and I hope that your strong message will continue out to the community, so we can continue to build those connections. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm nervous. Thank you, that was beautiful.